So if you have heard about a term called mob programming, the idea is that we all of us solve the same problem, and the reason for why one might want to do it is this allows people to question the decisions. This allows us to understand why code is written the way it is written, what else could have been the way in which it could have been written, right? These are some of the things, apart from other many other ideas. So that's the kind of basic idea about mob programming. I don't know how usually it is done in a small group, like 5 people is what I've done in the past. We have more, so let's see how this goes. All right. So what we want to do in this bi-weekly series is we will work on the same problem. It is a fairly simple problem statement. You can see Golang grep. I think most of us have already implemented this in the past. But the idea here is that we do it together. Meaning, one ideal way I would like to do, which is not possible today, is I would not like to actually share screen and be the one who's typing the code. I would ideally like someone else to do this, but it will be too much. So I'll try to do both the roles of a typer, or a, someone who's typing the code, as well as I'll want you to question whatever I type, and we figure out what's the good design, why we're doing something the way we want to, right? That's the idea. So this is, if this is not an interactive session, agar yahan pe kuch zyada, if we can't talk more and discuss, then the session is kind of waste. So I would encourage anyone and everyone to talk more or ask questions if something is not clear, or they would have done it some in different way or whatever, right? So again, the idea is to also try to do test driven development fashion, the real true by the book kind of TDD fashion. I believe not many of you have done this in the past, so that's another reason I will have to drive this today's session. Agla wala jo Thursday ka hoga, there someone else can drive, and then it will make sense, right? So okay, so with all that said, okay, this is what we want to implement, right? We want to implement a grep kind of command. Is anyone here not familiar with grep? Please like say something, then we'll quickly talk about what grep does. If not, I'll move forward. So what I've done is I've created a simple dummy project in, okay, very good. So we have, yeah, this is a project that I've created. Here I've added the get program, whatever the problem statement here, and I have assigned maintenance or read write access to everyone on GitHub. So you should also be able to clone and maintain this. It's a private repo for now, and that this is a repo that I've cloned locally. Okay, this is the basic from which we are starting. I am doing this so that it just saves time. Okay, so everyone familiar with grep command, right? Talking to a wall. Okay. Yes. तो क्या करेंगे अभी? We want to write grep implementation. What is the first thing that we can do? What is the first thing that, so ignore all the other like नीचे वाला part, बस ये करना है. Right, so we need a main function. I'm guessing can't do anything about that right now. So I'll write a main file. So maybe write a simple application, okay, whatever that generates. Okay, add it to this. Okay, so main. One of the things that I do as a first step whenever starting a new project is I try to run it. So I just try to do whatever the basic println, and I would like to see that it works. Okay. So this is what I'm doing. Again, I'm using IntelliJ. You probably can do some of this in VS Code and other editors as well. So like you can check, but yeah, okay, so the program runs correctly and we are able to see something printed. So at least the basic setup is there ready. Now whoever has implemented or not implemented, आप बताइए अभी what we want to do is we want to write test first. So this is the whole point of test driven development, that we don't write any production code, we write the test case first. So any idea on what can we test and what is it that how can we start? कैसे करें इसको चालू? कुछ thought, कुछ questions, anything from anyone?
Let's assume कि एक search function है, which is returning me all the strings that contain the particular search string inside the file name. So we can write a test on that function, whether it is returning or not. So we can start from there.
Okay, so some search function test. So I'll first create like a file called main test, I guess. So I'll create a file called main_test.go and add it to GitHub. And then what should I write? Any other ideas from anyone? So the TDD ka jo, if you are new to the whole test driven development and pair programming, after 1 hour you might see कि we achieved literally like we wrote 5 lines of code. ऐसे आपको लगेगा, but that is normal initially. I would say don't get discouraged that by it, because most of the time in code is spent like not writing the code, but to really discuss what is it that we want to build and how. If we spend more time there, then writing code becomes much more easier and trivial. You don't have to modify or change a lot of things. That's the whole point, right? So any thoughts to that search function कि वो क्यों करे, क्यों ना करे, कैसे करे?
So initially when we are starting with TDD, तो पहले we just assume this search function is a black box. We don't know how we will implement this, but we just know the requirements that if I provide the file name to it, it is supposed to give me the actual matches with the search string. So we can.
If you go on.
Hey, Jadi, please continue.
Yeah. So see, okay, if you look at it, what I really need is I pass a pattern, I pass a file name, and it should, in a good case, it should return me a true that it matches, right? Or it should return me the that particular set of lines, right? So what I can say is that I want the lines that should be returned whenever I pass my pattern. Okay. This is what my basic requirement. Can we divide this further more? I'm thinking.
What I got from today's reading is initially, instead of refactoring now, we just should focus on the requirements and then create a test. It will fail initially, then complete the code, sure, get it running, and then maybe refactor it later.
Yes, that can be done, but the objective is to actually get something. So I assume that it should return me something in a very happy path. That's it. That's the bare bones that I want, and then I can actually start extending my code as well.
Correct.
Cool. So 2 points, right? The keywords that I want all of us to remember when writing not just this program but other Falabi is happy path is one thing that I heard somewhere, right? And second was refactoring. So what someone also said about कि requirement क्या है उसके वजह से उसके हिसाब से करते हैं, correct? So one thing, the biggest hurdle of identifying the first test case is like that's where the thing starts. What is the first test case? Like if you want to do test driven, तो test क्या लिखे मतलब? And that's where the question really starts. One way to simply start is one way is to list down the happy and unhappy paths. That gives us some more idea about the problem domain itself. So कोई भी problem in like real life, API development, backend, SRE, DevOps, take any problem, you will always have happy and unhappy paths. Okay, so list down the, I would say this is one way before you start writing any code, try to list down some of the happy and unhappy paths for the code base. So what could be the happy path for this? Let me, if I were to write down, happy path will be search a string in file and it results in a few matches. Does that make sense? That whatever the string that we pass, it actually is contained in the file. That means the file also exists and the string is found in the file, and we print, like that's the output that we generate. That's the happy path. Right? Is everyone okay with this happy path? कुछ और अलग लगता है कि ये happy नहीं है और थोड़ा happy बना सकते हैं इसको, ऐसा कुछ है?
I think maybe, I mean, the way I think is because it is a unit test, I try to first think in all the smallest possible units, like a mental kind of a model, like what all small functions that I'll have, and then like instead of writing those functions, I'll just test this function. So one thought that came into my mind was like, can I search a substring like in the string itself? So there will be a function which will search for a string in a set of characters. So not a file, but set of characters. So how do I read that file is a different story.
Got
Something
it.
like that.
Yes, makes sense. Yeah. So what you basically alluded to is that top down करना है, bottom up करना है. Top down is where you identify this as a test case, the one that we are talking about here. That's its one big end-to-end बोलो उसको आप बोल सकते हैं. It is not a unit really test case. It is more like, okay, the entire requirement is kind of small enough. If you think about it, like we all have a sense कि ये program अगर लिखे, forget test even. If you just write this program, it will be like what, 10-15 lines program, right? For this happy path, कि file पढ़ना है, and we have to loop through the file, read each character, read each line, just figure out if it contains the word, and if yes, print it. 10 to 15 lines का code रहेगा maximum, right? So we here what we could do is we are thinking top down. We are thinking, okay, let's we think the end-to-end thing scenario and write that down. What you otherwise refer to is bottom up in some ways. Bottom up is you figure out, okay, what is how can I break this problem down? In order to search for a string in a file, I will probably have to read the file, read the contents of the file. I will have to, so that becomes again a small problem statements in itself, right? I will most likely need a substring finder that given a string, can it be, does it, is that string found in the line or not? Right, so that is the bottom up part where I can search a substring in a string. Like I'll need some functionality like that. And then probably also I'll need a functionality called reading the file line by line. And most likely then I'll compose these two together by, okay, I'll read the file line by line. For each line, most likely I'll run this, call this function in some way. And if it is found, then I'm going to print that function, print the output in somewhere, right? Does that make sense for everyone? Like most of us, at least.
Yes.
So one way is to go bottom up and top down. तो एक तो आप पूरा लिखो और उसको अंदर जो लिखना है उतना ना करो, या फिर you write test cases for these small parts and you build the small functions and then you assemble them together. My personal preference, अगर मेरा खुद का आप पूछो, and somehow this is sort of is what I have made it work, what has worked for me well, is I personally prefer top down, because with bottom up the challenge that I have seen is we don't know और क्या क्या लग सकता है. ये प्रॉब्लम काफी सिंपल है तो शायद इसमें आप बॉटम अप कर भी सकते हो, कोई प्रॉब्लम नहीं. But typically what changes when we do bottom up is the API contract. We don't know what's the exact API contract of the function we do. Search substring वाला function लिखे तो is that, will that be used as it is or will I need to pass some other information to that function?
Makes sense.
वो सब मतलब इट्स लाइक ऐसे समझ लो कि लेगो ब्लॉक्स जो आप बनाते हो वो आपने छोटा बना दिया एंड देन वो फिट ही नहीं होता, मतलब ब्रिज या जो भी है कि अरे इसका तो राउंड चाहिए बट मेरे पास सर्कल है. So those are the problems that we run into most likely in real world.
Oh, yeah. Also, one word, like in my experience, whatever I haven't done a lot of TDD, but whatever I have understood or tried doing it, like I just tried in one of the projects, And where I've observed it, if I really do not know what is my end state will gonna look like, I haven't able. If there are unknown unknowns, TDD comes helpful there, and the top down starts like, okay, this is what I'm expecting, or what all it takes to actually get me there. The code actually starts evolving in such a fashion.
करेक्ट. तो ये भी मेरा ऑब्जर्वेशन सिमिलर रहा है दैट इफ वी डोंट नो व्हाट द थिंग इज गोइंग टू लुक लाइक और प्रॉब्लम में क्या होगा, तो स्टार्टिंग विद अ टॉप डाउन टेस्ट केस हेल्प्स अस फिगर आउट द डिटेल्स. And the other good part about a top down test, why I find this much useful, is even if we change the implementation tomorrow, even if we refactor the code tomorrow, the top down test case typically doesn't change. With bottom up, what will happen is if you found out some interface, yeah, some test case for a string search function, reading line by line function, but थोड़ा कुछ अगर उसमें change हुआ API contact, तो आपके टेस्ट सारे फट जाएंगे, ब्रेक हो जाएंगे, and you will probably still need to write a test case which is covering the entire functionality of the application. Right, so for now, for this problem we'll try top down. Maybe we can take up some other problem, we'll force ourselves to try bottom up to really see कि, या फिर what we can do is इसी problem को बाद में हम लोग bottom up से भी कर सकते हैं. Like we'll just delete the entire code and again try to think from scratch. थोड़ा difficult होगा but ठीक है. Right, so these are some of the things I want us to think about. कोई भी प्रॉब्लम को पहले फिगर आउट करो उसके क्या है, like what's the happy path, also figure out what's the unhappy path. So what could be the unhappy path in this case, or not so like, failure points basically in this example.
Won't exist.
See that again?
File won't exist.
Yeah, file doesn't exist. What could be others if there is any?
String matches but doesn't output.
Like the
Matching string doesn't
matching
found.
string, yeah.
Okay, matching. So file doesn't contain the string.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is one bit edge, but I don't have enough file descriptors.
Okay, ये तो system level, yes, not enough file descriptors.
I mean, it's a very edge case, but
yeah,
possible.
But the file contains the string, but your matcher doesn't give a correct output.
हाँ, मतलब वो तो कोड का एरर हो गया फिर. That I wouldn't say that's an error case. Happy path.
Some sort of format problem issue, like encoding or something like that.
Yes,
Or
yes.
maybe a different file.
Yes, that's a very interesting one. Okay, file encoding problem. तो एक और यहाँ पे है file permission error is what I will say, right?
Read permission.
हाँ, like आपको file है, exist करता है सब कुछ है, but permission ही नहीं है. You can't read as a user whoever is executing.
Also, the file is not a file readable file; it's a directory.
Okay, yeah, directory instead of a file. Yeah, that's another one. Correct. So ठीक है, सही है, काफी हो गए मतलब अभी, right? So what we can also try to do is try to characterize them. Again, this is purely learning point of view, तो we are spending more time here. We're like यार आधा घंटा हो गया, एक भी लाइन निकलेगा कोड का, ये क्या है? But this is where we'll learn more about problem solving, breaking the problem down into smaller bits, right? So let's try to categorize these into, I would say, two types of errors. So if I were to categorize them, I will say some of these are IO errors overall, right? So what are the IO errors? एक तो file, like this could be encoding problem, basically this will manifest into an IO error inside the inside our Golang या Java या Python या कोई भी अगर अपना कोड होगा उसमें IO input output error आएगा क्योंकि some problem with reading file simply, right? It could be because it doesn't exist, it could be because there is no enough file descriptors, it could be because of encoding, permission, directory instead of file. So except this case, okay, all of these kind of are IO errors. Would you agree?
Yes.
Right, so all of these are IO errors except this file doesn't contain string. File to, in this case we're able to read the file, but yeah, the actual string doesn't contain, right? So these are called sort of, you can again categorize this into like, so this I would categorize as a functional requirement. This is something that
Is considered an unhappy path. It is supposed to not return a string if it is
Correct.
not.
Correct. So yeah, I was coming to that. This is more like a functional requirement, right? Which is unsaid in the problem domain. Like problem ने सिर्फ happy path आपको एक दिया है कि ये string होगा, ऐसा search करेंगे तो it should print. Here it is assumed that if something doesn't contain, then what should happen? That should be a question that we should ask. So this problem doesn't specify the requirement very clearly. If you were to go from implementation perspective, we don't have a lot of answer here. Okay? So we can, because we know we are implementing grep, and grep by default doesn't print anything if there is no match, we are trying to emulate that. But if it's a real world problem, like they were real world requirement that you got on a project, I would encourage all of us to ask this question. Okay, what happens if the file doesn't exist, or what happens if search string is not found? What do we do? Is there going to be output? Is there going to be a message, sorry, the string doesn't exist? Or is it going to fail with an error? What should happen? This is where we are trying to discover the requirements better. And as you work more and more on kind of problems, right, you will know that what would you do, or what should you do in this case. So a sane person can assume that, okay, let's actually not print anything, and let's run an exit status of 0 only. This is not an error scenario really. Does that make sense? Like that could be one way to handle this. Like, okay, this is not an error scenario. This is actually the file doesn't contain the string, so we are not going to print anything.
Right.
Yeah, ideal behavior for.
Yeah. Another way, one I want us to think about this is typically, like, tell me what's the return type of this function. So whatever, let's say there is a function, right, which is basically taking this input. If you think of this program as a function, or at a very high level, these are the two input strings to the function, right? What is the output data type for this function? If you were to really just write one function which takes these two inputs, what is the output data type of this function?
Slice, array.
Array of strings.
Array of strings, right? So mota agar function signature, if I were to write, so function signature is nothing but the entire line, like the signature of the function. The signature consists of the function name. So you will say like func name, parameters, right, and return types. So this is a signature of a function. This is called a function signature. So if you were to write a function signature for this function, so what is the name that we can write? We are talking about this function. Okay? Maybe I'll split it this way. It will help make things easy, I guess. Yeah. So imagine we want to write a function which takes these two things as an input and produces this output. What would we even name this function as?
Search file. Search in file.
और बताओ. Okay, let's start with search in file. So search in file को क्या होगा? What are the params that we will pass?
The pattern and the file name.
So we'll call it pattern and file name as string, right?
Right.
And the return value will be
Slice of string.
this is a function. Suppose मैं just return nil करके compile error निकाल देता हूँ उसका. तो अगर आज एक भी कुछ भी नहीं लिख पाए ना तो भी ठीक है. By 6 PM if we just brainstorm on the naming, because naming is one of the hardest problem in software, right? So any thoughts on this function like signature? क्या अच्छा है, क्या बुरा है? Does it capture things correctly?
This should return error as well.
Okay, so this function doesn't return error. So error में कहाँ पे return करूँ? Error?
The array of string.
Error should ideally be the second.
Yeah, it should be a second parameter.
Okay, why?
More of like a Golang convention.
Correct, right? So again depends now on which language. ये अभी now the rubber is meeting the क्या tire जो meet करता है इसको. तो Golang में हम लोग हमेशा error बाद में रखते हैं. That's the convention that is followed in Golang, in standard library, everywhere. So that's why this function, we realize this function is not just search in file and it should return not just return this, but also probably return an error. Anything else that is either missing or could be further improved or could be different in this?
I think it is good to actually run this. Run the test.
Say that again.
This should be good enough to run the test.
Okay, this is a good enough function to run the test case.
Test.
Test. Okay, ठीक है. One input I have is this is a hack that I use almost for any project, is the names, right, that we use. Try to use the names from the project problem domain. What I mean by that? Can I? Okay, I mean, I'll probably give a hint. Like, is there anything in these three names that we can use from the problem domain?
Pattern can be search string or
Okay, so this pattern, मतलब कौन सा pattern है तो इसको you can say search string str something like that. Okay, छोटा सा कुछ अगर चीज change करना है तो this or this. So again यहाँ पे हम तो थोड़ा again there is no right or wrong decision solution here. It is वही जितना the whole purpose of the code is to make the intent clear. Expressing the intent is what we are really addressing here. Is this code expressing the intent that is supposed to? If it is not, then that is what we would like to fix. And intent is very subjective. Like मुझे शायद समझ जाए, किसी दूसरे को नहीं समझे, या फिर किसी को समझे मुझे नहीं समझे. So it is very subjective. So again, there is no magic formula or anything like that. So we also don't want to fuss over a lot of small things. As long as it is decent enough, we move forward. वो भी एक real world में होता है. अभी के लिए because we are learning, so we are fussing over every small thing, right? And trying to see if we can make it even better. ठीक है, तो one suggestion was यार pattern को आप search string कर लो, तो we know कि this is the string that is being searched in the file name. Okay. What is the example input to this function? Like how will I call this function? So it will be like search in file. तो मैं function में लिखना पड़ेगा. चलो कोई function में लिख देता हूँ मैं to make the compiler error go away. How do I call this function?
We can take the example from the README.
So I'll just say okay, search string or whatever, however it is written, search string और क्या?
Absolute path of the file.
Okay, absolute path of the file. So now this is where that you just said it. तो यही question था मेरा कि when we say file name, is it going to be like okay abc.txt, or is it going to be home, like the whole path? Right? What should be the how should we pass it, or what makes sense?
ideally it should be just the file name, because like os.read file का save and that is from the root directory of the main function, main file.
Any way you can define why it should be a file name instead of a full path?
I think it is when you say a full path of file name, it should just take up a string. Now it doesn't matter that it's a file name or it's a full file. As and when we progress, we will be able to identify that all the guardrails or the code that we just require. For now, we'll just take a string. If either pass a full absolute path or a file. I'll look into the path as it is, as of now.
Okay, so if I made a function invocation in these two ways, are they equivalent or will they can they produce different results? मतलब समझ रहे हो कि
Yeah, so the first function can also implement the second one, but the second one cannot implement the first one, I think.
right. So second one assumes some current working directory. Does that make sense? There is a implicit current working directory assumed somewhere in the second function. And when we say in the program, we're probably going to say os dot file, whatever, right? New file or open file. We are probably going to assume the directory, and or even if we are not assuming, the Golang will assume the current working directory based on where the program is running or whatever, right?
Yes, issues happen when you try to run it via different methods. When you go into the particular directory and then run it via go run main.go, or else if you are running from some other directory by providing the complete path of the main file, then this is going to mess things up if you just provide the file name.
Yes. So इसमें से कौन सा यूज करें, मतलब और कुछ थॉट है या क्या है, कुछ सोच रहा है किसी को और, क्योंकि we probably should
Yeah, for ease the second one should be used, but in an ideal scenario the first one is what we should aim
for. Got it. Yeah, so that's an interesting point. That's key. For ease of API depends now on the other. So the answer to this cannot be just given in isolation, right? That is what we are saying. Okay, I mean, you can use this or that. Really, what do you want? Pick one. It's up to you, really. Right? So this is where the context of about the problem, program, etc. depends, and that drives the decision. If we say that the first one is more generic, right, in a sense, but it also requires you to specify more information. It is more explicit than implicit in some ways. Right? Does that make sense? This is more explicit, right? Where you have to clearly say, okay, unambiguously tell me what file are you want.
Right.
You could also do this program this way, like something like this, if you had that option. मतलब अगर ये bash का मैं अगर लिखता हूँ, if that is how I want to execute it in bash, I mean by passing these parameters via CLI, then I'm going to say, okay, current working directory, then this file inside that. So this is also an ambiguous way of specifying what file I want.
Right.
So one, again, there is no right or wrong solution. ऐसे कुछ मतलब, this is really is an opinion territory, and also depends on what you want to do, etc. And that's why you can't just copy paste this opinion everywhere. You have to apply it in that project ka context, team ka context, the other things that are done in this project and whatnot. If everywhere in the file dealing you have always dealt with relative paths, then you would want to, for the sake of consistency, use the relative file path. If in the other project or other code base on the project, if you always use unambiguous full file path, then you might want to, you should use the first one. So this is where your decision making will, that's how you can work on that decision making part here. Again, I'll tell you my personal preference in this particular case, and this drives the, my personal preference would be to do the first one. And the reason for that is when this eliminates any assumptions in the code. This does not assume anything. It allows you to, it gives the caller the control. Of course, they have to do more work, but then they have the full control of what they want. There is no implicit assumptions in the code about things. And most of the bugs or issues or problems in the code are also caused by lack of explicit assumptions, like, explicitly saying, okay, this is what I implemented. If we make things implicit, then this results in issues or errors that we don't anticipate. So in this particular case, like personally, my preference would be to go with this. Of course, दूसरे किसी का ये होगा तो भी nothing wrong there. Okay, there is no right or wrong as such. Depends on other context, but the rationale that I have for this is the idea that we want to make things explicit whenever possible, especially in a that kind of helps with documentation and other stuff. Like imagine इसका मैं documentation लिखना होगा, तो somebody will have to know, okay, what's this function will return different output based on what is the current working directory, things like that. Any thoughts so far? Yeah, मतलब ये कुछ.
Yeah, one thought I got is in regards to this specific problem. I mean, the requirement is kind of looking for a user to pass in the file name.txt, right? So like
Yes.
that should be easy for the user is what they are trying to think.
Okay,
is
yeah,
what
that's a good point. So if we really go, this is a very important point. So yeah, so with this purely, if you just had this, then yeah, you would implement the second approach. Correct, agree. One way is to also think, do we want, is it okay for users to ask them to do more? If not, then yeah, implement the second. Actually, yeah, if I really go by, that's a good point which I missed, then the requirement will have to change. Okay, I have to pass the whatever path to file. ऐसा कुछ अगर होता तो पहला वाला implement करते. अगर because we have this in the project as a requirement, so it makes sense to implement this. Okay, cool. Actually, that makes sense. You convinced me actually.
No, but I agree with the other points as well.
So वही है. तो अभी now in that case, then what we will have to do is we'll have to tell whoever created the requirement, yeah, does it make sense? Because how does user search other files which is not in this directory?
Yep.
Then they will have to go back. Oh, actually, yeah, that's a good point. We never thought about it, which is what typically will be the response mostly. Then we can tell them, look, why don't we give this file path, the full file path? Is that okay? So that's the negotiation that we will end up doing with the product team or business or whoever.
Yep.
Okay. ठीक है. So this is where it is at. एक और चीज so one thing then we can do here, if we go with this approach, then I would argue that we call this a file path than file name. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because if I say file name, then again there is ambiguity, right? Expression of intent is not there. अच्छा, file name मतलब सिर्फ name भेजूं कि क्या करूं? Purely, if I don't know the implementation of this program, just by looking at this title, we will all be confused. Okay, what does it mean when they say file name? Do they want the full file name or do they want just the name? So making it like file path would make it more explicit. Again, the expression of intent is there. Look, we want the full file path. If you want, again, you can do the Java way, saying okay, full file path or like all the, but generally Go में जितना छोटा use करो उतना better होता है. That's again the language convention. So file path makes it more clear. What are you looking to do if you go with this approach? Okay, अभी I'll try to move. So एक last यहाँ पे point. Again, this could be a nitpick, or again, not many people or not everyone might agree here. How about we rename this as grep?
That'll be confusing. But yeah, otherwise.
My grep, I think.
Yeah.
My grep, yeah.
Grep might be conflict. Yeah, by looking at the current requirement, it's fine to give the name as a grep. But in future, whenever we add provide some more ability to add more functionality, then we need to touch this function again to accommodate the uh,
Correct.
other functionality basic.
Yes.
So that might be rework.
Correct. Yes. So very valid point, right? So again, this is very nitpick bolo ya. I'm sure most of us agreed to this point very easily. Okay, file path makes sense because yeah, that is correct, right? But grep, there are, it is not very clear as to whether we should rename this as grep or not. So we can keep it more specific right now as the function does, instead of making it a bit more generic. So grep is going to be a generic word. Okay, grep can be used in future for other stuff or whatever, right? So now this is where, yeah, it depends. So search in file is something that we can still go ahead with. Happy to go with grep also, no problem. The if we go with grep, what the onus is on us to ensure that the name of the function still describes the same intent later, right? So the refactoring becomes the onus on us. Okay, so what all, I think 15 minutes hai. I don't think we'll be able to write more stuff. So I just want to sort of take a recap of what all we talked about. So any problem domain that we get, one way to write down would be, before writing the first line of code, break the problem down, understand the problem more deeply, understand the happy path, understand the failure path, right? The happy path is this one. The unhappy paths are these, and the requirement that we talked about for 0 matches, that is also kind of a happy path, you could say, or you could argue it's not an error case, but it's like unhappy path, or just one of a case in terms of requirement, right? For errors, we can lump them into multiple categories. This just helps us figure out if we need to handle each of these errors separately, or can they be lumped and handled in one go, right? For example, if the file is not found, do we want the user to to be indicated that yeah, I couldn't find the file, that's why your command is incorrect, or something like that? Do we want the user to know that sorry, I couldn't open the file because there was no enough descriptors, or there is a file permission error, right? It really depends on what is the abstraction for users that we design. Because this one is a CLI application, it is quite okay to actually expose all of these errors to the user directly, because they will want to take action based on these errors, right? Expecting a file instead of a directory. If user passes a directory and we don't want to search, we don't want to allow searching a directory, then we can give this error. So each of these, like overall, these are IO errors, but in our case, we could argue that yeah, each of these should be handled and should be returned back to the user as it is, so that the user has more information about the error and they can choose to decide, they can choose what they want to do. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Cool. So we also talked about top down, bottom up. This will again be the thing that comes up again and again. How do we break the problem down, or do we assemble the problem from already pre-built components? Usually, in my personal preference, or like having implemented TDD, etc., somehow I have leaned more towards top down, because it helps me visualize the things better instead of being able to because this requires more clear understanding. I think as you might get more and more comfortable with TDD and solving various problems, bottom up might become more natural to you, because you will start seeing the abstractions right away. अरे ये लगेगा बना देता हूँ और एक साथ चिपका दूंगा. But as a newcomer, it is difficult to see how did you think of this function, like कहाँ से सोचा आपको, right? ऐसे सारे question आएंगे. So there top down kind of helps, because it allows you to break the thing down into smaller parts. Cool. There was one last thing that I right, yeah, so we want to talk about, we discovered this part, which is pretty interesting, right? The return type is not just a string, like a slice of array, slice of strings. It is slice of string and an error. That is a very important thing that we discovered as part of the function signature. Right? That is very important. Whenever you see an array as a return type, okay, you have to write these three cases, test cases: 0, 1, many. कभी भी आप कोई भी जगह पे आपको रिटर्न टाइप एरे का दिखा तो उसके 3 टेस्ट केस दिखने चाहिए मिनिमम. वन टेस्ट केस दैट विल ensure that the array is empty, and वो केस चलता है अच्छे से बराबर से. One where there is only single element in an array, and one where there are many elements in the array. What I mean by that is, if you think about our case that we said that file permission error नहीं को कट किया मैंने, but paste कभी किया नहीं. So these are IO errors that we talked about, but there was another error that we said, which is string doesn't, like string not present in file, right? Whatever the search string, it is not present in the file. So this is an example of this 0 case. Do you agree?
Yes.
दूसरा एक होगा एग्जांपल जो कि यहाँ पे दिया है इन्होंने, कि मैं इसको सर्च करता हूं तो एक ही आउटपुट आता है. और सिंगल मैच एक्चुअली, also single match, right? And this obviously is many matches. So any time you encounter a array, always like have these 3 test cases. Even if you don't write them, you might just say, okay, you know what, actually I'll write this many वाला test case, उसमें 0 और 1 भी cover हो ही जाएगा, क्योंकि मतलब हो ही जाएगा. And most of the cases में आप, yeah, I'll agree with you, but as long as you have not written the code in a wrong, like मतलब ऐसे आपने कोड लिखा है specifically तो सही है, but like for example some idea is जो अभी Golang में range वाला जो है ना, range on lines, suppose this is the range वाला loop जो होता है, तो this loop or this code base is or this code base can handle all these 3 cases without any problem. Because if there is 0, then इसमें जाएगा ही नहीं कोड. अगर 1 होगा तो भी एक ही बार जाएगा clearly बराबर से. And if it is many, obviously many times it will go into the range loop, and you will get those values. But you can also write code which does not handle this properly. तो उस केस में आपको you have to think about these 3 edge cases or 3 cases for any array. And this is not only applicable for return type, but also applicable for input. So whenever a function takes input, like array of strings as an input or a slice of string as an input, I would always write 3 cases, या मतलब एटलीस्ट मैं देखूंगा कि मेरा कोड तीनों के लिए चलता है कि नहीं. अगर मैं सेपरेट टेस्ट केस लिखूं ना लिखूं सेपरेट प्रॉब्लम है, but will ensure that my code runs for all these 3 cases. Okay, does that make sense?
Mostly it is very important to think of these test cases whenever your function is expecting a slice or array as an input than the output, because the handling output is the responsibility of the caller, but input that is your responsibility to handle, whether that input is given input is with having a string or not. So that is really the responsibility of this function. So it is more on the checking the or having those test cases for the input than the output, I would say.
एक और केस यहाँ पे मैंने हैंडल, मतलब वी कुड आर्ग्यू नहीं किया हमने हैंडल, जो कि है nil का. If we pass nil to like, okay, this is a function that actually accepts, let's say, a string, slice of string. Suppose मैं ऐसा करता हूँ, ठीक है, some lines. Again, not the same function, ignore the name, etc. But suppose ऐसा कोई function है, या even file name, file path के लिए. So I think reference data type के लिए Golang में problem होता है, where you can actually pass nil, right? And then you will get a nil pointer, dereference, or Java में null pointer क्या exception बोलते हैं उसको, या things like that.
So when we are designing by contract, then we are explicitly saying that I want such input, and then I'll provide this exact output. In that case, the responsibility just reverses, because then the caller is responsible for providing you the correct input, but you are responsible for providing the correct output as per your contract.
Yes, so इसको थोड़ा सा we can, this is more nuanced, as what you said makes sense. The way this is nuanced is that every function typically has what are called preconditions and post conditions. And what was the book that you were only reading, right, Mohit? आपको कुछ तो उसमें एक और third वाला एक चीज था,
class invariants.
हाँ, invariants, yes. Class तो नहीं पता मुझे, invariant पता है. तो so a precondition is simply means don't accept garbage. Like अगर इसको मैं थोड़ा सा दूसरे भाषा में बोलूँ तो it will be like garbage in, garbage out. So if you accept garbage, then you will also produce garbage. Like if you take this function और इसको आप nil accept करोगे तो your program will also probably fail, or like it could blow up. Now where this is actually applicable is for public APIs or public functions, which are typically library code. उसके लिए आप वहाँ पे सारे input arguments का typically validation करोगे almost. But because this is going to be a private function which is not going to be used by anything else apart from our test case right now, तो इसमें हम लोग इतना bother नहीं करेंगे. Does that make sense what I just said? So imagine I was like writing a public API. Like imagine whatever grep का जो भी functionality है मुझे library जैसे मुझे publish करना है, npm package बोलो या Golang का मुझे कोई कैसे publish करना है, so that other people can reuse my code. In that case, I will, and if it's a public function, then obviously it will start with a S, like capital, right? और उसमें I will ensure that all the parameters that I am the input parameters, I will validate them. I will ensure this. If I don't like to accept a nil as an input here, I will check. So I will say if lines is nil, whatever nil hai, to throw some like error or return an error saying sorry boss, like you have to pass a proper array, like you can kachra mat becho kuch, something like that. So this is especially applicable for public functions, which are mostly library functions if you think about it. For private functions or functions that are just being used by our programs, which is typically I would say 99% of the functions, these conditions don't matter that much, but they are also something to be aware of, where there could be errors that could come. So this is where it is a balance. कितना आप safeguard करके रखना चाहते हो आपके कोड. Okay. Yeah, I think that's it. आज के लिए इतना ही है. मतलब कुछ और we were not able to write test case etc. But what I'll do is I'll commit this code as it is, like जितना भी ऐसा लिखा है वो. Next time the idea would be someone else who would like to volunteer for writing the first test case next time and driving the like sharing the screen. Thursday को करेंगे ये. तो
I can do it.
Okay, so next time Mohit will drive the screen, share the screen, and we'll actually try to write the first test case. Cool. So आज के takeaway अगर बोलूँ तो these are like the takeaways that find out happy path, unhappy path for any code, right? Break the problem down into smaller ones. figure out whether top down or bottom up, which way it makes sense to actually do based on your comfort area also. Then other would be try to identify good function API signatures, try to figure out how we will handle errors. And the last would be for these kind of scenarios, we will in future when we work from next time, we will actually try to write these 3 test cases, and then we might decide, look, our code is written in such a way that we can actually cover all of this maybe in a single test case. In this case, I think I can clearly see that that is happening, but ऐसा कोई भी आगे भी cases हो सकते हैं जहाँ पे we might not see that, and we might end up writing separate test cases for this. All right, and yeah, that's it. We spoke discussed a lot about naming the functions, the parameters, and why expressing intent is the most important thing to do in the code, right? So that if you just look at the signature of the function, you can figure out what the function does without having to go through the implementation of it. All right, okay. I'll commit this code as it is. Commit message क्या डालूं? Again, help me with some good commit message.
First commit.
वो तो ऑलरेडी हो गया, 2 कमिट ऑलरेडी कर चुका हूँ.
Identified the happy path and unhappy path maybe.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so wait, commit message में again like some quick idea is, yeah, like, ये जो so इसका कोई तो स्टैंडर्ड है ना. आई थिंक सीताराम ने कभी तो पिंग किया, पोस्ट किया था, मुझे याद नहीं है देयर ऑन द कॉल और नॉट, बट one is you start with a verb. You don't basically say what I did. It should not be in a past tense. It's kind of in the current tense. Present tense. Okay, identify this and this. You don't say identified this and this. You will say identify this and this. ये किया मैंने. So it is in the present tense. Again, you can, ये convention है. Okay, तो ऐसा कुछ right or wrong नहीं है. But
नहीं, actually वो yeah, the reason being because he identified अभी किया है, but this is not yet merged into the master branch. So we have multiple branches, right? So whenever we are implementing some feature, that is going to be merged, and while merging that, so it is the present thing, right? So that's why it is it should be a present message for the present tense.
Correct. सही है. ये नहीं पता था मुझे. Yeah, this makes sense actually. सही है. Right. So for now we'll push the commit on master branch itself. We won't create, because one like reason why we have code review is because we work alone, right, in some most of the cases, and then we share our work for review. But इस केस में अभी सबने देखा है काम, सबको अग्री है, कुछ होता कमेंट तो इधर ही बोल देते लोग, आई एम होपिंग, राइट? तो if there is no comments, then कोड तो लिखा ही नहीं, हमने क्या ही लिखा है, but you get the idea, right? So if we typically in pair programming, then the idea is to not have another review, because then if you have to have a review in pair programming, तो क्या ही कर लिया फिर आपने, मतलब उधर क्यों रिव्यू नहीं किया? That's the thought process. So अगर mob programming, तो it is even more like everybody in our project is actually working together on this. और अभी किसी को कुछ प्रॉब्लम नहीं था, तो इसको रिव्यू में डालेंगे तो बस बटन क्लिक करके अप्रूव ही करने वाला है सब, राइट? सो that's the idea. Cool. Anyway, I'll commit and push this as it is, and next time Mohit will drive this and we'll take it up forward. सही है. Cool. So Thursday को करते हैं, इसको आगे लेके जाएंगे आगे. All right. Thanks. Bye.
Okay, nice.